I feel like I've been had to some degree, and a lot of people feel like they've been just, as a big bait and switch. We'll call them women in these certain contexts, and everything's fine, and then they, you gave them an inch and they took a mile. So definitely you need to be wary of the slippery slope anywhere that it arises, because it feels less like a fallacy nowadays and more like almost an inevitability, at least on a lot of the social justice topics anyway.
Yeah, the slippery slope has become almost an ironclad rule. It's only, it's not even that it's not a fallacy, it's that it actually ends up happening most of the time, it would seem. Welcome to the Veritas podcast. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I have on evolutionary biologist and managing editor at Quillette Colin Wright. Colin, thanks so much for being on the show.
Hey, I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to have you, Colin. I followed you for a while. I think you're one of the most important people in this sort of sex and gender ideology debate. And, loved seeing you on Rogan a few months ago. You do a lot of great stuff. I've read your articles, seen you on Twitter for a while. The issue of biological sex denialism and gender ideology is one of the most important issues to me, and I'm imagining to many people in my audience. I want to ask you to start off, if you want to just kind of introduce yourself and maybe work your way into how you ended up being kind of one of the frontline soldiers, if you will, in the battle of biological sex and gender ideology. How'd you kind of end up on the front lines of that one?
Yeah, I'm just as shocked as anybody, probably the most shocked of what I currently do for a living, or what I at least talk about on a day-to-day basis. I was, just until early 2020, I was an academic scientist. I was working at Penn State. I'm an evolutionary behavioral ecologist. I usually just go by evolutionary biologist because that's behavioral ecology, sort of a subset. But I studied animal personalities, collective behavior, and social insects and arachnids. So that has nothing to do with what I do right now, but I was sort of just happily going about my career as an evolutionary biologist. Went to grad school, got my postdoc, was applying for a bunch of professor jobs. And during sort of the last couple of years of grad school, and then during my entire postdoc, is when I really sort of became aware of the rhetoric surrounding sex and gender. And for a while there was always this split where I talked to people about trans issues, and there was always this split between sort of how you identify and then your sex. It was, you're trans if you identify as the opposite sex, but sex was always something that was very stable in people's minds. And so I never had an issue with that. It was always, okay, as long as we're very clear on biology and the identity side, even though there's issues with the whole concept of gender identity, but people have this inner sense sometimes of who they feel like they are, whether it's male or female, and sometimes people's internal conception can be at odds with their biology, and it gives them sort of an anxiety, and that's what we call gender dysphoria. But then the conversation shifted to where it wasn't people merely denying that they're, saying that they identify as one sex. They were sort of trying to blurring the lines between sex completely. There were articles that came out in Nature by Claire Ainsworth that was, describing sex as more of a spectrum, and that there's more sexes beyond just male and female. This was coincident with articles in Scientific American talking about the sex spectrum and having a big diagram showing that, there's just male and female on one side, and then there's this whole range in between. So that's when I just sort of saw that this wasn't merely a small little contingent online. This was actually becoming more and more mainstream. And I started writing some articles about pointing out this fact and how absurd it was. And initially my contentions were just as a biologist saying people are getting the biology wrong. But as I got more and more into it, I started realizing more and more that there are just so many social implications that arise from this fundamental denial of biology. And so that's kind of what I do now. I left academia for many reasons, partly because people were piling on me on Twitter, and I didn't want to have to do all these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements that I didn't agree with. I got a job at Quillette, so I can kind of write more articles now and be more of a public figure, not worry about getting canceled, etc. So that's sort of how I arrived here, even though I could not have predicted me talking about sex and gender basically full time.
Yeah, you're one of the many sort of exiled academics. You're in good company. There are lots of great people in that sort of category of people who, they could no longer exist in a space where it just wasn't feasible to try to stand up for reality and be an academic, unfortunately. I want to ask you, just to sort of get an understanding of exactly your position and what we're talking about, how would you, and you already got into this a little bit, but if you could expand on it, how would you differentiate between biological sex and what people are calling gender or gender ideology? And then what I really want to get to is, do you think that gender in and of itself is a useful term? Because that's something that I always kind of question, is that a word that I've seen you use a lot is obfuscation, and it seems like gender ends up sort of obfuscating the whole issue as a whole.
Yeah, so gender is probably one of the most used and abused words currently in the culture wars. There's several different meanings that people have. This can either refer to, sex-related differences in personalities and behaviors. It can refer to the social construct of behaviors where, sort of how society, the cultural norms and expectations that society puts on individuals based on their perceived sex. It can be thought of as an identity. There's all kinds of these ways that people talk about gender, and no one really has the same definition. So when we get people talking about gender, everyone's just talking past each other, and no one likes to define what they actually mean when they talk about it. When I talk about biological sex, there is some confusion that comes up both within the scientific community and the way people are interpreting this. We've all been taught that, at least in biology class, that an individual's sex relates to, the type of gametes that are produced. But I like to go a little further than that, because people always contend, like, well, what if you don't make gametes? What about, adolescent males who aren't producing sperm yet? Are they still considered male? And then we have, other species, other, reptiles, amphibians, plants. How do we describe whether individual plants or mammals or reptiles are male and female? And this largely just comes down to whether or not an individual's their reproductive anatomy is organized around the production of either small or large gametes, ova or sperm. So this means that, if you're born like a newborn baby boy, it's still going to be a male, even if it can't produce gametes, because it has its reproductive system is organized around the production. This holds the same for plants. This is how we can tell, even on the same plant, sometimes they'll have male and female parts on different sides of the plant. This is how we tell what, male and female alligators are, even though their sex-determining mechanisms is how the temperature that they are incubating at, rather than chromosomes, for instance. So this is what we mean when we talk about males or females. Now, for the vast majority of adults, if it's humans generally, their sex is completely unambiguous. Only 1 in about 5,000 individuals born might have some degree of sex ambiguity at birth. But we're now being told by people that sex is this whole spectrum. They're inflating this rate of intersex people to try to suggest that it's all just sort of, this fuzzy concept, and all the lines are really blurred between what males or females are. We're seeing people move away from even saying males and females and talking about just these sort of clouds of maleness and femaleness. There's this, like, bimodal spectrum. And so this is just a completely false way to interpret these things, because what we have in reality are people who are just like unambiguously male or female, like a trans individual. They're not intersex. Trans is completely separate, and they're just trying to identify in other categories completely. So that's kind of where we are right now. I hope I addressed all the questions that you had in that. Maybe I might have...
No, I mean, more or less. No, I mean, it basically, what it comes down to is this is an issue of science, and you get a lot of the people who are always saying, like, stand up for the science, kind of denying the science. You got into an area that I think is really interesting, which is this idea of going off of the rule, which is right 99.9% of the time, versus the exception. Because one of the arguments for gender ideology that is brought up often, and I believe something akin to it was brought up during the Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire was recently on Dr. Phil. They were talking about, like, what about women who don't have, you know, full female reproductive systems or who can't give birth, who are infertile, and then, you know, other things that are brought up are people who are intersex. And these are, as you said, people who are, they're a very small, like really small portion of our population. And the way I always try to phrase it is, this would be like if you went to a clothing store and all of the gloves had 6 fingers on them, on each hand. And you were to go up to the clerk and be like, why can't I find a 5-fingered glove? And they're like, well, we need people with 6 fingers to be able to put their hand in the glove. And it's like, but only a tiny, tiny portion of the population has 6 fingers. Why are we building this entire structure around that minority? Do you think that's kind of a good way of explaining why those arguments don't necessarily hold a lot of water? Is that, yes, there are some people who are in a somewhat ambiguous category, people who are very, very much ambiguous in terms of their sex. But really, even most people who are intersex, as I understand it, they are still technically male or female. They just have some intersex characteristics. Can you get into that a little bit, sort of this exception versus the rule mentality and where it gets a little fuzzy?
Yeah, a lot of the activists have this idea that if you can point to sort of anyone who sort of blurs any sort of boundary, therefore the boundary is completely irrelevant. It doesn't even exist, and we can just, the categories are just completely blown apart, and you can just, you know, there's no rules anymore. So they'll might take the case where maybe there's an intersex person who, man, it's really difficult to just pin them as being male or female. They have, you know, their chromosomes are sort of, you know, interesting arrangements. They have mosaicism, where part of their cells are XY, part of them are YX. They have gonads that are part testes, part ovaries. You know, there's conceivably in my mind there could be an individual. I don't know of a specific example of one, but at least I think it's possible that there could be some individual that develops that could really just be sort of sexually ambiguous in a way that, you know, you need a committee to come in and be like, more this way than that way. So that could conceivably be the case. But that wouldn't then blow apart the existence of male and female as real categories. That would just mean that, you know, we have an unidentified individual, this undefined person who's still 100% human and deserves all human rights that they could possibly want. And, you know, maybe it would come down to sort of a committee of what we legally designate them as, or maybe we need another legal designation for being truly intersex in some way. I've used a coin flip analogy before in some papers that I have, where, you know, we talk about flipping a coin, and a coin has unambiguous heads and an unambiguous tail sign, and these heads and tails don't come in, you know, percentages. It's either 100% heads or tails. You know, there's not a mixture. You can't ever just get a mix. But there have been some experiments where they've flipped like a nickel, and I think 1 in 6,000 flips will actually land on its edge. And so you can get these edge cases, but the existence of the edge of a coin and that as being an outcome doesn't mean that heads or tails no longer has any meaning whatsoever, and that they're just arbitrary, or that we, you know, if we get heads, we can just say, like, oh, actually that's tails. Like, that's not a move you can actually do in reality, and human development is kind of like that. For the vast majority of people, and it's actually very close to the amount of times a nickel will land on its edge, 1 in 5,000 as opposed to 1 in 6,000. The outcome is completely and unambiguously male or female, and they're not intersex. You know, for that 1 in 5,000, yeah, we need to be able to talk about them and what that means for them as an individual, but the notion that these just completely obliterate the categories of male and female is pretty absurd. And especially when you go, when you try to insist that this means that sex is a spectrum and we can only talk about maleness and femaleness, you kind of go into this regressive playground bully logic where you'll associate these male and female traits on a spectrum, and so someone could be more or less female depending on the types of characteristics they have. Like, we'll see things on, like, the genderbread person, which is something that is taught to kids, where they'll use traits like how hairy you are, how deep your voice is, voice pitch, things like that, as determining your positionality on this gender or this sex spectrum. And, you know, I'm just remembering kids back when I was in grade school who maybe we had an effeminate friend who was a male, and people would bully him, saying like, "Oh, you don't have very much body hair. You have a high voice. What are you, a girl?" type of thing. And according to the sex spectrum, you could get one of these teachers could hold up this sex spectrum figure and look at it and say, maybe they are more of a girl than a boy. And it's pseudoscientific, and it's also, I think, just morally wrong to treat people like that. So on just about every way you look at it, it's wrong.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, and it really seems to have exploded, particularly this ideology within the past, 10 years. I really like the coin flip analogy, because one thing that people will note, for people who are watching this, you don't call it heads, tails, or edge. When you're flipping a coin, nobody says, or edge. You can also call edge if you want. Nobody calls edge, because it's a maybe 1 in 6,000 chance of happening. And I think it's a good metaphor, because we are kind of, in some places, allowing edge as an option to call. We are building society around a very, very, very small minority of people, because even if you take trans people who are biologically male or female, but they, quote unquote, identify as one or the other, that's even a very, very small portion of the population. And there's even a lot of research that's been done into this idea, and maybe you want to talk about this a little bit. I know Abigail Schreier has done really great work in this area. There's some research about the fact that some of the people who are identifying as trans might sort of be socially coerced into doing so. How much do you know about that, or want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is one of my main issues with the way that gender is commonly taught in schools now. We can talk about sort of the old way we used to talk about what a trans person was, which was based in gender dysphoria, but dysphoria was largely just diagnosed based on this really very early in life onset of cross-sex behaviors, combined with this insistence and persistence from a very young age that they felt like they were a boy in a girl's body, or vice versa, and it persisted through puberty up until adulthood. And research suggested that these individuals, if it is consistent and persistent and insistent, that they will likely benefit from transitioning later in life. So we've sort of abandoned that as being what we call a trans person. Or someone who has gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria now is largely conceived of as just not identifying with these binary social constructs of male and female, or what a man and woman or a boy and girl is, which reduces down to sex-related stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. When people say that they're non-binary, for instance, they're not talking about the sex binary, they're talking about the sort of social construct of gender roles in society that we ascribe to people based on how we perceive their sex. There was a recent article in the New York Times that talked about men, women, and gender non-conforming people, as though all men and women are by definition gender conforming, and that something like a tomboy would be, no longer a female, or couldn't call them a girl or a woman. The genderbread person, school educational material does this too. It talks about how your gender, whether you're a boy or a girl, relates to, manness and womanness relates to things like your job and your personalities and your preferences. So we're now looking. So the consequence of this for kids who are probably thinking about sex and gender in very simplistic terms, they can see their behavior, their personalities, their preferences, and they can see the behavior and preferences of their classmates around them. And people can see patterns. They can notice that their male friends behave in ways on average that is different from their female friends, and they can see where their sort of personality traits reside in relation to these overlapping distributions of personality traits and things like that. And if you're a boy who's more effeminate, and plenty of boys are more effeminate and sometimes more effeminate than the average female, and vice versa, some girls are more masculinized than in their personalities and preferences than sometimes the average boy. They're now using this to be evidence that they're perhaps born in the wrong body, that they're trans, they need to identify out of these categories because they might not agree with the social construction of these gender categories. I don't identify with these categories of, hyper masculinity or hyper femininity. So we almost all fall under this non-binary label when we use their definitions of things. And this wouldn't be really a problem if we're just going to identify people as boys or girls colloquially based on if they're masculine or feminine. But the issue is that this is now being used as a diagnosed medical condition. If you identify if you're a female and you're identifying as a boy based on these social constructs, then you're considered to have dysphoria. Maybe you're going to be given puberty blockers so you can buy time to figure out what your true gender is. And this can lead to surgeries and things like that. So we really are just pathologizing and medicalizing gender nonconformity now, and that's where I think is one, child abuse going on. I think it's a medical scandal, and so that's where I put a lot of my focus on the current gender ideology. Sorry, that was a lot, but
no, that's okay. It's yes, that is one of the. It's one of the things I definitely wanted to talk to you about. Is that particularly what we have going on in the medical field, what we have going on and this is it's been baffling for me to see. I studied social sciences. I was a poli-sci major in college, so I'm super ignorant about this kind of stuff. But I always sort of viewed, and I think most people viewed, the hard sciences, medicine, biology, as the pinnacle of professional integrity and the ones who protect us from political, being compromised politically as a society by some kind of cultish ideology like gender ideology or the broader social justice ideology. So like I was saying, these fields, particularly medicine, but also biology, were seen as the pinnacle of professional integrity above politics. And somehow they were infiltrated and subverted by this ideology. We are seeing, like you were saying earlier, in medical journals, very reputable ones, or at least formally reputable ones, we are seeing this bowing to the political pressure on this issue in ways that damage the lives of children and other people seeking medical help or seeking psychological counseling on these issues. I mean, you can have a person who is under 18 going and saying that they feel this way and getting no questioning whatsoever that could possibly lead them to desist or to maybe find out, in many cases people find out that they're just a gay man and that's actually a way that they can live their life that is affirming of some of these traits. So my question to you on this issue is, what happened with the hard sciences? There was so much rhetoric around the social sciences may fall, but the hard sciences never will. They're going to be safe. This was a line you heard a lot circa 2016, 17. What do you think was the sort of weakness that was exploited? What was the thing that people were missing when they said that? Why did these fields that seemed so above politics how did they end up getting politically compromised?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the shift that a lot of these human rights organizations made when they were initially funneling tons of money into the gay rights campaign, wanting to get gay marriage passed. You had the human rights campaign. Almost all the money of these major human rights organizations that are waving the rainbow flags to get gay marriage passed, something that I was 100% for myself, and think it was a really good thing that we have. That gay marriage is legal. But once that was passed, you have an issue with these organizations that are set up to sort of defeat these big injustices, is that once they defeat this big injustice, there's this huge apparatus. They have tons of momentum as a institution, and you can't really just expect everyone who works at these places to just turn the lights off, pack it up, go home and say, we've achieved what we have set out to do, and there's no reason we need to be here anymore. So a lot of these organizations, they sort of exist with the business model that is designed to put them out of business, because once they defeat the thing that they were created to combat, then logically they should no longer exist, or at least exist in a much lesser form. But that's not what we see. We have all this funding still there, and so all of this funding that was previously put in sort of the gay marriage thing has just been funneled into these other small fringe issues, and they need to create this boogeyman, this bad guy again. They need to make sure that there's just as much injustice always, because that's where they're getting their funding from. And so they create issues where there basically are none, or shouldn't be. in order to portray it as this, that we're some morally fallen society. So in terms of academia, I just think that people have built in their minds so much this association with the rainbow flag people, the LGBT movement, as being just almost defined as being the good guys on the right side of history, that they can't decouple these rainbow flags with a new regressive ideology, because all the people who used to be opposed to those, the rainbow flag people, were legitimately very regressive, coming from a religious point of view, and very much oppressive, I think, and so decoupling this rainbow flag from all things just good in the world and being morally superior is really difficult for people to do, especially people in academia who it's largely just shifted very much on the left side of things. They're unable to really combat these things. So, for instance, when I was first in academia, I would write a lot about intelligent design and things like that. I would argue against those things. I was always just encouraged because I was attacking what were mostly just, conservative religious people. And so there was no pushback from within the academy. But when I started pushing back for similar reasons, they're infringing on biology, they're trying to blur the categories of sex, it was very much the opposite. People associated, people just accused me of being transphobic or something. And there's just this stigma. No one wants to be labeled these horrible things, and so they just keep their mouths shut. So there's a lot of this environment of fear going on that perpetuates this cycle that allows sort of this false consensus to be portrayed in the academy of people being all for these sort of regressive pseudoscientific ideologies. I think we're getting to a place now where more and more people are comfortable speaking up about it, but they've taken a lot of ground in just the last few years because of people being silent about it. So I think that is largely the reason why we're here right now.
Yeah, it sounds like the problem basically within the scientific fields in the academy, whether it's medicine or biology, whatever, it's more or less the problem that was seen in every other institution that this ideology has infected, which is that you create an us versus them mentality. You create a binary mode of thinking when it comes to sort of this subtly political aspect of your work, even if your work isn't supposed to be political. If you're a doctor, there's supposed to be nothing political about what you do. If you're a biologist, there's supposed to be nothing political about what you do. But it seems like there was this infiltration of a political mindset, the seed of which was planted, if I'm hearing you correctly, before the last 5 or 10 years. Maybe it goes back even longer, because I haven't looked into it. I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe that if you look back at the fields of medicine and biology and most fields that require a college diploma or an advanced degree, even going back to the 90s or the 80s, you would see that there is an overwhelming majority in those fields that would say they lean to the left politically. And that number gets even more and more overwhelming. Somebody who's done a lot of great work in this area is Jonathan Haidt. He's written about this sort of ideological dominance in academia, how it becomes a problem. If I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like there didn't need to be a specific weakness within medicine or biology, because we saw this with journalism. This is what happened in journalism. You just ended up at a point where 9 out of 10 journalists felt that, left good, right bad, and eventually that ideology kind of snowballed into what it's become, which is journalism that, as you were saying before, they have, words like menstruator and pregnant person and all of this kind of weird language. It sounds like there didn't need to be a specific weakness to the sciences, because that's what I've been wondering about lately, is like, what was it about the sciences that we didn't see as a weakness? It seems like it was the same weakness that every other institution, whether it be the media or the tech sector or particularly the Democratic Party, when it comes to politics. Would you kind of generally agree with that it's not a question of what was the weakness specifically within those fields? It's more so that what this ideology has a tendency to do, that those fields just weren't immune to that.
Yeah, to some degree, I think that's true. I think a lot of it is the lack of viewpoint diversity that we have in academia. I think that makes it really easy for a lot of these bad ideas to just sort of spread like wildfire through these things. We had some of the old ideologies that are a lot of these new things like gender ideology are based on. These have roots in academia, going back many decades, mainly in the humanities, like the whole critical theory, queer theory type stuff. These were largely debunked during the whole, Sokol hoax back in the day when he was a physicist or a mathematician, and he submitted sort of these fake papers to these postmodern journals in order to show that they were completely bunk and they'd publish anything as long as it sounded jargony enough. Well, this is the same thing we have going on right now. It's still based on this sort of postmodernism. Everything is based on power differentials, sort of viewpoint epistemology where you gain better knowledge, insight based on where you score on this hierarchy of oppression and things like that. Everything's a social construct. This is being perpetuated largely now, even though it's the same thing that was debunked a long time ago, because they've managed to sort of armor plate themselves within the LGBT movement, so no one wants to criticize them. And they've made it so any criticism of these types of ideologies now is synonymous with bigotry, whereas before they were just sort of these lofty philosophical beliefs that really didn't have any real-world implications. They were just silly and pseudoscientific. So there was no social cost to criticizing them before, whereas now the social cost is very, very high. And so they use that as a way to just make it so people stay silent and to create that false consensus that I mentioned before.
How do you think that process works, particularly when it comes to this issue of biological sex denialism and gender ideology? Because what strikes me as being so unique about this issue when it comes to this process of people, they're afraid of being called a bigot, right? That's what you were getting at. And this is something that we see repeated among different sort of affinity groups and identity politics pushes, whether it's kind of the Black Lives Matter when it comes to race, the feminism when it comes to women, and then on this issue, the thing that strikes me as so strange, though, is the speed at which there was a 180 in how people talked about certain topics. Because when it comes to race, there has always been a certain amount of sensitivity about race. Like you can go back to Rodney King in the LA riots in the early 90s, and you see some of what we've been experiencing with Black Lives Matter even in the early 90s, even before that. Feminism has been something where there are the stereotypes about like the bra burnings in the 70s. I wasn't alive back then, but I know that these things. It seems like the gender ideology stuff is newer. Like if you'd asked people in just the year like 2011, just like about 10 years ago, if you'd asked them like how many sexes are there, 99% of people would be like 2. This is just 10 years ago. This isn't that long ago. If you'd asked them in 2014, 15, it would still probably be like 90% would be like 2 sexes. Then you get to like 2016, 17, 18, like that kind of like 3-year period or so. And all of a sudden it gets way, 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 way more like 50-50. Like all of a sudden people are just very rapidly changing. And what it really comes down to is it's the issues of what exactly is going on with race in our country in particular. It's a very complicated question because you have this long history of undeniable oppression of black people. Obviously, they came to this country as slaves. And then you have the issues of policing and crime and how they interact and all that. On this issue, it really comes down to just the reality of what men and women are. Like, it's this more fundamental question where it seemed like people went from having a very good understanding, like a mutual understanding of men and men or women are women, and this was very, very recently the case, to all of a sudden it flipping. And I don't think that's the case with race and with feminism. I think those battles go back much further and had much more of a kind of drawn out, or even gay rights on its own, right? Yeah, the Stonewall riots back. You didn't really have these battles over what is a man and what is a woman, unless there's something I'm missing, until really the past like 10 years or so. What is so different about this, and how were the activists able to flip it so quickly from like 99% of people having an agreement to it being completely obfuscated to the point of being almost impossible to discuss?
So you mentioned a lot of this gender stuff really came about, 2016, 17, 18. Well, if you'll remember that gay marriage was legalized by the Supreme Court in 2015. So that marks the shift of funding towards a lot of the whole gender ideology stuff and the trans movement. So this is why it really got injected into the mainstream. There's been figures I've seen that showed amount of like the funding that was organizations like the HRC we're putting in things like gay marriage versus trans issues, and transitions were always a very small fraction, and then almost immediately between 2015 and 16, the vast majority now is going to trans. We're talking billions of dollars. So, I mean, we're seeing this redefinition of what a man and woman is based on, stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, the same way that we're seeing sort of the definition of what it means to be racist is. I mean, just recently, some organization just updated their website with their new definition of racism, which used to include being...
It was the ADL.
Yeah, the ADL, which used to include prejudice against sort of all races, any race based on, the color of their skin, to now it's racism is only defined as something that white people can do to black people based on their institutional power. So it's impossible to be considered racist if you're non-white, basically. So yeah, these definitions are basically astroturfed, based on funding, combined with this whole environment of people not wanting to speak out against it because they'll be immediately tarred and feathered as a bigot for doing so. So money and social coercion, I think, explain 90+% of what we have going on right now. It's wildly effective. And my goal is to sort of lower the costs, the social costs of that type of coercion, because if you're the first one, if you're the only one to stand up, then you get all the arrows. But there's only so many arrows they can fire at people. So the more people that sort of stand up and push back against this, you sort of create this more inclusive environment where people will feel more comfortable to speak up about these things because they know they're not the only one in the room anymore who's thinking these same thoughts. And that's what I think we need to do to sort of overcome this, is just overtake that social stigma, and people will be like, okay, you're going to be called a racist, but that just unfortunately can't come with the same sting that it used to, which is also a bad thing, because being called racist should sting, because it should refer to something that is very serious. But they've really overplayed their hand so much where, unfortunately, the term has been watered down to be almost meaningless now. So maybe we'll get back to a place where where there's meaning again and it actually stings again.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying, the kind of work that you want to do on this, is very important. I mean, people need to feel safe standing up for, on this particular issue of gender and sex, it's just basic reality. And then also just parsing out issues, whether they have to do with race or gender or sexuality, in a way that is not completely one-sided. I mean, there's a very narrow window of what you can even discuss within this sort of progressive or social justice-oriented framework. I do wish that people like yourself, and to some extent I'm guilty of it too, I wish that we'd all kind of gotten our bearings earlier, because it seemed like it would have been easier to start these really concerted efforts that have come about in the last 2 years or so, whether it's the creation of FAIR, which is a really interesting organization working mostly on critical race theory in schools and some of these issues. I wish that those efforts had started earlier, because, what it comes down to is this is about our society's ability to draw hard lines on these issues, because with the power plus prejudice definition of racism that you mentioned before, that's been around for a while. That was floating around for a while, and now it's made its way into the ADL's definition of racism, which is unfathomable because it's such a ridiculous concept. And it's so nakedly obvious why that definition is used, but I want to focus more on the kind of the sex and gender issues. So on this notion that I was getting at of we need to draw hard lines, and I wish we had done it sooner, I would sort of exemplify that by pointing out that, I can't remember the exact timeline, but it was around maybe 2010, they were talking about having, gender identity incorporated into Title IX protections and these anti-discrimination laws, and then everyone's kind of like, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty, and then you get into the bathroom stuff, and people are like, okay, I guess people should be able to use the bathroom, whatever, but that debate never really resolves itself completely, and then we move on to, you got to use the preferred pronouns, and people are like, that's a little strange, and then you get into men are now competing in women's sports, and people go whoa, what the hell, what happened? And then what I keep pointing out to people is well, you kept saying basically that the ideology that undergirds the concept of a man competing in a woman's sport is okay, and you're just going to kind of let it run roughshod over society. My question for you, Colin, is, this is a hard question to answer, but I'm really curious to hear your perspective on it. Where do you think we draw the line as a society? How far can we go as a society if we want to accommodate some of the desires of trans people and trans activists? How far can we go with that before we end up kind of denying reality as a result? Where should the line have been drawn ideally?
I mean, I draw the line at any time you're forced to actually lie about something. So I was always fine referring to trans women as women. And I mean, and I still am in like a personal social context. I'm more than happy to use people's preferred pronouns by and large. Because there was always this deal that it was more of, you know, I wasn't literally calling them biologically female. It was always sort of this social, I'm going to do this for you while you're around just because I know it gives you anxiety, because you have gender dysphoria, so I'm not going to say things that are going to make you feel uncomfortable around me, even though that's sort of this agreement where, you know, I'm not literally calling you a female. I'm just referring you to this in your company to make you feel better. And this is what trans was largely described as, you know, just identify one way and your biology is something else. But it was the very moment when that line was being blurred, where I was being asked to call trans women female rather than just, you know, a woman, you know, based on identity. That's where I drew my line, you know. I'm not going to actually lie in those contexts in order to appease anyone, because you do need that fundamental reality. And reality needs to be acknowledged first and foremost if you do care about things like social justice. You know, you have to be able to first identify the problem. And if you're going to try to fix real problems about social injustice, you need to know that the actions you take are going to actually address the problems that are really there. So anytime you're asked to actually lie, I would say that's where you have to draw the line. You know, there's a difference between sort of social accommodations in some contexts, but when it comes to writing laws about these things, who gets in what sports, we're going to start accepting trans women to be in female spaces like prisons and bathrooms and things like that.
What could possibly go wrong in the prisons?
Oh yeah, no, it's completely bonkers. So we need to be able to understand when we're actually just doing, you know, social accommodation versus enshrining these things in the law, you know, a court of law. There's been incidents where in courts the judge has made some people refer to trans women as female, like they're making them lie to the judge, which made it almost impossible to even talk about the issue at hand, which had to do with the fact that, you know, their sex wasn't what they were insisting it was. And so anytime you're asked to lie, you just need to be able to stand up to it and not go along with this. You know, there could be some more blurry areas of where that might creep into, and I'm much less likely to be socially accommodating in other contexts now because I feel like I've been had to some degree, and a lot of people feel like they've been just, you know, as a big bait and switch. You know, we'll call them women in these certain contexts, and everything's fine, and then you gave them an inch and they took a mile. So definitely you need to be wary of the slippery slope anywhere that it arises, because it feels less like a fallacy nowadays and more like almost an inevitability, at least on a lot of the social justice topics anyway.
Yeah, the slippery slope has become almost an ironclad rule. It's only, it's not even that
sure.
It's not a fallacy; it's that it actually ends up happening most of the time. It would seem
almost,
and yeah, and I can relate to your experience of, you know, I come from a background. I mentioned I was in the College Democrats. I know that you're somebody who you're not a conservative. I mean, you're somebody who, you know, until probably fairly recently would have described yourself as leftist liberal. Yeah, I've seen the cartoon you posted on Twitter about, like, you know, the left leaving you. So people probably see it before on Twitter. I still consider myself
on the left. I'm not sure what that means anymore, but I mean, I voted Democrat up until in the last election. I voted for Tulsi Gabbard, if that means anything. Even though
I actually did the same thing. That's very funny.
Nice. Even though she's considered
I wrote
just
in
like
Tulsi
some
Gabbard.
alt-right troll now, apparently, but yeah.
Yes, yeah. She was a good person for people like you and me to vote for, though. That was a tough one choosing between Trump and Biden. I'm glad that. Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of really interesting things in what you just said. So I think that you pick a really good place to draw the line, Colin. I think that that's kind of the best place to draw the line is are we in society being asked to lie? But then you got into exactly where I kind of wanted to push you a little further, which is that a lot of people feel like they've been had because there was this really, you got into something really interesting, which is the subtle agreement between people like you or me who strongly believe that there are these biological definitions of men, women, but that, we're nice people. We encounter somebody who is a trans person, non-binary, whatever. They identify one way or another. We want to be, the word, it is always said that, like, you want to be polite, you want to be kind. You and I think we're like nice dudes, kind people. We want to be nice to the people we're interacting with. And that's a very important part of our society, is that people be nice to each other in these personal interactions. It's interesting because that desire seems to conflict with the desire to tell the truth. Because what ended up happening, and you were kind of getting at this, is there was the subtle agreement of, like, all right, I'm going to use these pronouns, I'm going to call you a woman in certain contexts, but that is something that I'm doing as a friend, as a fellow human being, to be kind to you. It is not something I'm doing because it jives with my view of reality. On some level, you did kind of have to walk this tightrope where you are kind of sort of lying. It's sort of this white lie, if you will, this nice little lie. Do you think in retrospect that is something that it should have been kind of nipped in the bud? Like, should there have been more of a conversation about... And I mean, in another way that I can frame this question is, if somebody were to come to you today, let's say you're at a bar with a friend, they have another friend who's trans, that person is, this is an adult person, this isn't a child, that's like a whole other thing. And they're saying, I'd really appreciate it if you could use these certain pronouns, refer to me as a woman. They're not getting into like those broader policy conversations, but would you still do that today, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, I mean, I still refer to trans women in the social context as a woman, and I'll use she pronouns. I think a lot of the issue is with sort of the generational divide now between a lot of people who identify as trans. So you get some of the older trans people, they usually tend to refer to themselves as transsexuals rather than transgender. Talking about like the Buck Angels of the world. I have no problem referring to Buck as a man. We use he, him pronouns when I talk to Buck. But Buck hasn't been indoctrinated to believe that they literally are a man and a male. Buck will be the first person to tell you that they're biologically female. They took hormones so they could appear as a man because that helps them get through the world better and feel like who they are on the inside, even though that's not actually, they're literally not the sex that they're portraying themselves as. So with Buck, I'm not really, I don't see it as me lying to Buck when I'm referring to Buck as he, him, because I know that in Buck's mind, Buck doesn't actually believe it either. Buck doesn't believe in the lie that they're actually a male, and so it just might help in social context. And actually, Buck doesn't even care if he's misgendered, because he's the first one to say he's not doing it for you, and he's comfortable in his body now, and he'll just write you off as whatever. Why would I care what you call me? This is who I am. And a lot of the older transsexuals, they understand very fundamentally what they are. They understand that they're not the sex that they're portraying themselves as, but it's just doing something to help them move through the world. And so I don't feel like I'm lying to them when I use their preferred pronoun, because they're not actually deluded about the state of their bodies and what they are. Unfortunately, a lot of the current generation of transgender activists, they're being told from a very young age that you are what you identify as, and that sex isn't real, and that you can just identify into these categories. And so I could see an argument where maybe, using pronouns for them would be less useful and would be maybe participating in the lie with them, because when they ask you to use their pronouns, they mean it because they literally think that they're the opposite sex or something. So you're sort of participating in a lie with them. So there could be some issues there. I'm less likely to probably go along with those people who are essentially asking you to participate in their fake pseudo-reality with them in their ideology when you use their pronouns. Whereas people like Buck, they're not asking me to participate in any sort of false reality. They're just, as a friend, makes them feel better or something being around them. So I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think the intentions of the people who are asking this of you, and whether or not they're literally deluded or if they're just, they're just asking you for a social accommodation. I think that's somewhat important.
Yeah, I am somewhat familiar with Buck Angel, and I've sort of heard from him this idea that, you know, there is a generation of trans people who might refer to themselves as transsexual, who, as you said, they very much, if you ask them point blank, what is your sex? Like, what is your sex? They would say, oh, well, my sex is, and then they would name whatever their biological sex is. In Buck's case, female. But, you know, and I know there are other people, like, I know Blair White is one person who is also very understanding of kind of the biology behind, you know, what's going on there. And I think it's interesting in this conversation that we are bringing up people who, there's an interesting aspect of what we're discussing in that Buck sort of passes very well as a man, just to be very blunt. Blair passes very well as a woman, and I think that people have a relatively easy time saying she or he as a result of that to some extent. You do have kind of an interesting situation where a lot of people, I don't know what other word for this is, so for lack of a better term, I'm just going to keep using pass as a woman or a man. And then there's more of that dissonance in your head if you have somebody who really, really is appearing to you as a man in every sense of what you believe a man is. And they're asking you to call them a woman. And it's more difficult in those cases. This is a really, really interesting area because I feel like what's happening is people like Buck and Blair White, they are unfortunately kind of the exception to the rule. They used to kind of maybe be the rule with another generation of trans people, but they really have become actually, from what I understand, a pretty small minority of especially the very sort of like socially visible trans people. At this point, it seems like generally the idea is you are supposed to, as you said, participate in that pseudo-reality with them to the point where you could have someone who appears to you in every way to be a man or a woman, and you're just being asked to sort of play into this role play where they're the opposite. What do you think we do in this situation? Like, because it's getting to the point where, on one hand, you want to be kind to people, as I was saying before, but now it has flipped to where people are almost using it as a tool of political pressure. Or as a sort of a semantic tactic where they're like, well, if I can get you to concede these pronouns to begin with at the beginning of the argument, it kind of undermines the whole side of the debate that is saying that men and women are fundamentally different and that they're in these binary categories. I've been very personally conflicted over this issue myself as somebody who considers myself a kind person who wants to be kind to others, whether they are trans, non-binary, gay, straight, doesn't matter. But I don't want to cede that ground. What do we do in this situation that we're in?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a single best answer for that. I personally am still willing to do the social accommodation with people that I know, or at least I'm friendly with. If I was maybe having a debate on stage with some activist or whatever, and because me referring to them as their pronouns might create this seeming contradiction between my position, like there's areas where I might actually revert to referring to pronouns based on their sex, but still, in a personal context in social situations, I'm still going to refer to people by their preferred pronouns, as long as it's either he, him, or she, her, and they're making an attempt to appear as the opposite sex. Like if you told me right now to use she pronouns for you, I'd probably not do that because you don't look like you're attempting to be gender nonconforming. You have a beard. Yeah. We've gone through absolutely no steps to to transition, as far as I know, and so it would be very difficult mentally to even use she, her pronouns when I'm talking to you. So I think there needs to be some sort of ask on their part where it's like, okay, well, you need to at least try to portray yourself as the opposite sex if you're doing that. And if you're at least making an attempt, then I'll make an attempt to do it. I'm not saying I'm going to get it right every single time, but I'll see what I can do. So I know some people don't agree with me on that. I get a lot of sort of the radical feminists who appear in my my Twitter comments, and they'll say, they'll correct me if I use she pronouns to refer to a trans woman, I understand where they're coming from. I'm not going to say that they're wrong. There is probably a use for that is important. That's just not what I choose to do. I don't think that's ultimately what I want to portray out there. I still want to have that degree of compassion for people who are genuinely have dysphoria, But in other contexts, if I'm not gonna actually lie if I'm asked point blank what their sex is, or if it's in a context where sex really, really matters, then no, I'm not going to refer to them by their preferred pronouns anymore. So it's very context specific, and there's probably going to be some edge cases where it's just going to be, depending on someone's call they need to make in that moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of different situations you can find yourself in. I know what you said is similar to something I heard Ben Shapiro say once, which is that essentially there's that personal context, but then if you're interacting with a person in a debate, it's very different because then you've got an entire ideological aspect to it. So it's a similar position to what he has, and it's something that I definitely struggle with. I kind of go back and forth on it because I want to be nice. Like, I'm not an inherently disagreeable person. I'm somebody who wants to get along with people and be kind to them, but on the other hand, what you said before about feeling had, I think would speak to a lot of people on this issue. I think that the slippery slope kind of reared its ugly head. I'm going to have to try and get Buck on my show. I'll have to see if I can get some contact information because I want to have this conversation more with a trans person. But I'll transition us over to another aspect of the conversation I wanted to hear from you about. And thank you for having the conversation we just had, because I know it's one of the hardest things to talk about on this issue. Like you were saying, you will get hit from so many different sides, whether it's the feminists or the trans people or the whatever. So thank you for doing that. I'm curious what you think the future might hold on this issue in terms of sort of the spectacles that stand out as like indicative of the state of the issue of sex and gender. So for instance, right now, the most horrific spectacle that has begun to be kind of very visible and very potent in the culture war is this whole situation where men are competing biological men are competing in women's sports. What do you see in the near future if we do not reverse trend on the sort of mass delusion, if we do not sort of wake up more people to push back on this stuff? What do you think the next step is? What are you kind of seeing coming around the bend?
I think we're going to win. By win, I think that's going to, male and female sports, I think is going to be overturned in the next few years, almost across the board, because it's one of those few, as you call it, a spectacle, that is probably the most undeniable thing you can imagine. I don't think a lot of people even realize that this was a reality until they just see it on their TV. The Olympics, we had Laurel Hubbard who was competing there. That was something that just woke a lot of people up to the insanity that's going on. We have Leah Thomas, the UPenn swimmer, who's just shattering all the records, in some cases beating the next woman by, I think, almost 40 seconds and just waiting there. That's just unheard of. I don't think that can be maintained for too much longer. I think more and more people clearly see that it's absurd on its face. It has only been able to get to the point where it is now because they've sort of changed definitions of what it means to be a woman behind the scenes, and no one's been able to vote on these policies getting in there in the first place. But I think that we're going to see a lot of people coming together to vote those policies out, or at least change the wording in a way that reflects sex instead of just gender identity, and do away with these exceptions that we have where, like, lower your testosterone below 10 nanomoles per liter or something, then it's acceptable. Like, no, you can't undo a lot of the stuff that male puberty sets you through. You're going to get a little less strong, you lose some strength, but it doesn't make your hands smaller, it doesn't make you shorter. There's so many irreversible things about male puberty that are long lasting, even if you lower your testosterone levels. And I think we're going to see a big push to get this out. So I think that's an area that we should have some optimism in. If that doesn't if it's not the case, if they continue to double down and let male athletes compete against females, you might see new organizations pop up for dealing with the same types of things, as new leagues come up that are privately owned and have their own rules that are going to compete with these. And I can't not see them doing well if the choice is, look, join this new league or compete against males and lose every time. So it's probably going to be one of the quickest ways, one of the quickest issues that'll get fixed, I think. And I hope that starts sort of the bbdomino effect through other things, like, prisons is a big one too, that is pretty absurd. And then needs to trickle on down to actually what's being taught in elementary schools about gender ideology fundamentally, because this is all just sort of the weird things in society popping up as a result of this whole gender ideology, and fixing things like, banning males and female sports. Those are just like little band-aids over the whole problem. And it doesn't address like the fundamental root issue, and that has to do with sort of the queer theory, gender ideology that's being pushed basically everywhere you look.
Yeah, it's almost as if we've maybe hit the line, hopefully. I do know that, people are waking up to the sports thing. I mean, that's something I'm trying to have conversations with some people in my family about, like, you can see this now really in a way where it is, like I said before, a spectacle. I mean, it is something that just shows you the fact that we have reached the point of officially denying biological sex. Where when it came to the pronouns and the bathroom stuff, again, it was sort of like this idea of, are you going to be compassionate towards people that need to have the right to be identified a certain way, or go to a certain bathroom or whatever. This is the point where it really has come down to something that was always based on science. We segregated sports by sex because of science. It never had anything to do with what people want to do. So I think that I hope you're right. It's an optimistic point, and I hope you're correct, and I think you might be correct. I think it is. I hate to get partisan on my show, but because I'm an independent, but it is political malpractice if Republicans do not absolutely beat this thing like a drum until the end of time. I mean, it's something where whether it's Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump, who I try to talk about him as little as possible on the show, Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump or whoever it is, they have to make this like in the top 3 things they're going to talk about over and over and over again, because people need to understand what's happening. It has absolutely reached that point where it is undeniable that it's no longer just about this conception of gender identity. It is absolutely an attack on the sexual binary categories when we're in and the combat sports. This is where it gets really interesting. You have women who are getting the crap beat out of them by trans women, like I can't remember. Fallon Fox was the trans boxer. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I really, really hope you're right that this is the moment that this thing actually turns around. My last question for you is just, what do you want sort of honest, courageous people to do on this issue? Like, what's your advice to people who are just sitting around at home and they're like, I know this is a problem, but I'm not sure what I personally should do about it? What would you say to the average Joe who's listening, who's like, I want to do something about this?
I'd say that if you're in a context where you can actually say something about it, if you're at the parent-teacher meeting or something and you see gender ideology in your kids' curricula, that's something you need to bring up to the principal and expose, send, make sure this isn't taught in your schools. One way you can do that is by submitting an incident report to, you mentioned earlier, FAIR, which is an organization actually I work for now, where you can anonymously, or you can put your name on it, you can submit these incident reports if your kids are taught these race essentialist ideologies, or if they're being taught things like the genderbread person, which tells them that they can just identify whether they're being a boy or girl relates to stereotypes of masculinity and femininity and what types of toys they like to play with. These are all incredibly regressive, and so you can anywhere you can in your life, if it comes up, can just be talking to your friends about it, or as I mentioned, if you're a parent, you can go to the schools about it. And also just try to support organizations who are trying to make these types of changes. Not everyone has the ability in their life, or even the opportunity maybe, to combat some of these things. But you can donate to the organizations that are doing that. There's Parents Defending Education, I think run by Erica Sanzi. She's really great. There's an organization in the UK called Sex Matters, and they're doing amazing work in all realms of society that deal with the consequences of denying sex. You have FAIR. They're more on the critical race theory side of things, or I guess they would just call it, sort of this new race essentialist ideologies. They kind of shy away from just labeling it CRT, which is probably the best way to go. But they're also now taking on a lot of the gender identity stuff, and I'm helping them do some of that. So support these organizations. They're doing really great work. Any little donation helps. This is, we're competing with things like the ACLU that I don't know how many billions they're getting every year, but it's time to have these new institutions that we're supporting that can actually start filing lawsuits and pushing back against this. So any way that you're able to push back, sometimes it'd be difficult because you could potentially lose your job for saying these certain things. So I'm certainly not going to discount that. So it really depends on what you're able to do in your life that you can help, whether it's donating or speaking up yourself. So that's what I would recommend.
I think that's good advice, and for those listening at home, watching at home, that's what you can do. Get to work, because people really need to make their voices heard on this.
That's really important.
Colin Wright,
think of anything more important than that. So yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, and thank you, Colin, for being on the show. I know we only had about an hour. Real quick though, before we go, is there anything you want to plug or promote? I know you just dropped a bunch of organizations, but in terms of your own personal stuff, anything where you're right? I know you might have a Substack, Twitter, anything like that. Fire away.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter, and my handle is @SwipeRight, and that's my last name, Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. I have a Substack called Reality's Last Stand, and that's realityslaststand.com is where you can find that. It's going to start turning into a weekly newsletter again. I've been having a gap in content lately, but it's going to be picking up. Actually, tomorrow is going to be another post on it, and it just deals with sort of covering the last week's news of sex denial and gender ideology, and keep people up to date on what's going on and the ways you can help address these things. So go ahead and check that out. I'm on Instagram, also @SwipeRight, Clubhouse, SwipeRight, basically across the board. I have the same handle, so check me out.
All right, folks, you know where to find him. Check out Colin's work. Thank you again for being on the show, Colin. Thanks for everyone who is watching, listening to this all across podcast platforms and YouTube. If you're on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. If you're on iTunes, 5-star review. Wherever you are on audio platforms, please follow the show. Thank you again for listening to the Veritas podcast. I'll see you next time.